to Barnes Philosophy Club. I'm Nick. It's not panto season.
Yes, it is. Get out.
All right, settle down. Usually this round, things will improve. I'm Nick, the chair of the club, and as you will have noticed, we're a public club and we meet to talk with philosophers and about philosophers every month during the academic year. So we run from September through to June, with a break for panto season in December. And we aim to promote a philosophical and thoughtful approach to life. But you don't have to have studied philosophy at all. All levels of philosophical knowledge and none are welcome. We're supported by the Royal Institute of Philosophy and also by the OSO. So thank you everyone who's bought a ticket today, and we have a £5 default ticket price, but if anyone can't afford that, there's the option to ask for a free ticket. So you're very welcome to do that. Today we're going to also attempt to record the talk for YouTube, which, subject to a review by our team of censors, will be published on YouTube along with lots of our other talks for you to enjoy. So you can find us Barnes Philosophy Club on YouTube and Facebook. Our format will be about 45 minutes for a talk, and I'll give John a wave or a shout as we approach 45 minutes if we're running a bit over time. And then we'll open up to questions and discussion for around another 45 minutes. And then please do stay on for a drink and a further chat until chucking out time just before 10. We have Robin, who will be filming us with his array of cameras, and then we have Paul, who will be nimbly skipping up and down the steps, taking questions at the end with our extra microphone. So this is the first talk of our new season. And we're organising around a new theme. Now, skeptics and cynics claim that my themes are so broad that they just allow us to have talks on pretty much anything that anyone wants to talk about. I can assure you that's not the case. They're very, very carefully and precisely framed. And our theme this year is the state, ourselves, and others. So we're going to be hosting a range of talks on political thinkers and how we interact with other people, whether real or artificial people. So we're going to be covering everyone from Marx tonight to Machiavelli, and we're going to cover thinkers from 17th century intellectuals through to ChatGPT. So there will be something for everyone. And today we are going to start with Marx, and more specifically, how to make sense of Marx. As our speaker John writes, in one form or another, Marxism has swept much of the world, being in large part fiercely secular, while also finding expression in liberation theology in South America and elsewhere. It has enticed intellectuals, and enticed a very good number of you tonight, I'm pleased to see. But also fundamentally about action rather than contemplation. For some, it inspires the deepest of hopes, and for others, the greatest of fears. So John's going to talk to us about all that and more. John read Philosophy and Theology at King's College, London, in the 80s. He's taught philosophy and religious studies in schools for more than 30 years. In 2019, he published his first book, Judging Religion, a dialogue for our time. He's taught at the London School of Philosophy for several years and is a tutor for the Workers' Educational Association. And today is a philosophy tutor with City Lit, and he's teaching courses now at the Critical Thinking Circle as well. So he'll say a bit about those at the end. But I will hand over now to John. Thank you, John, and welcome.
Is it possible to turn off
to turn down this light?
Turn down the lights a little bit, Tom. Is that okay?
Yeah, we're doing that. Trying my best over here.
Working on it.
Well, can I say thank you ever so much for being invited to come and speak here. I'm going to begin.
Can you talk a bit louder?
Yes.
Microphone up a little bit, Tom.
Is the microphone working?
Not very good.
Not at all, right?
Ah,
There we go.
is it working?
Yes.
Ah,
We're on.
wonderful. Okay. Well, I want to begin really with with a fairly straightforward question. Why? Why study Marx? Why be reflecting on Marx? I think that's a reasonable place to start, since we're going to be thinking about Marx for the next hour and a half. And various things that I'd like to start off with in thinking about this. That he is perhaps one of the most important philosophers, as well as economists and social theorists of modern times. Certainly one of the most influential, if not the most influential combination of those things. And if his thinking has any great amount of truth about it, then the consequences will surely be really revolutionary and will turn all of our lives upside down. Another thing about Marx's thinking is that it's a total ideology. I remember some while ago going to a course in anthropology, and it was run from an entirely Marxist point of view. I remember too being in Havana and going around a museum, and everything was put in terms of Marxist vocabulary. The entire world was seen through a different set of concepts to the ones with which I was more familiar. But for all of that, there is great dispute about what Marx is actually wanting to say. There's dispute between Marxists and the great variety of Marxists that there are, and also from those quite outside of Marxism, as well as dispute between those groups too. Let's get the slides working. I've just put this up really as an accompaniment at this point to some of what I'm saying, a little bit about his biography. But what I really want to bring to mind is how persuasive Marxism has been to various people. And in particular, I just want to show one particular, give a particular account, really, of how persuasive Marxism has been. And this is a quote from Arthur Koestler, as found in Richard Crossman's The God That Failed. Just operating this, here we are. Tired of electrons and wave mechanics, I began for the first time to read Marx, Engels and Lenin in earnest. By the time I had finished with Feuerbach and State and Revolution, something had clicked in my brain which shook me like a mental explosion. To say that one had seen the light is a poor description of the mental rapture which only the convert knows, regardless of what faith he has been converted to. The new light seems to pour from all directions across the skull. The whole universe falls into pattern like the stray pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, assembled by magic at one stroke. There is now an answer to every question. Doubts and conflicts are a matter of the tortured past, a past already remote, when one had lived in dismal ignorance, in the tasteless, colourless world of those who don't know. Nothing henceforth can disturb the convert's inner peace and serenity, except the occasional fear of losing faith again, losing thereby what alone makes life worth living, and falling back into the outer darkness where there is wailing and gnashing of teeth. My first encounter with Marx and Marxism was as an undergraduate, where I had to write an essay about, the extent to which, Marxism is a religion. And this passage, I think, really puts that question to the fore. If we, begin to think about, some of the emotions that are involved, and the sense of being captivated by an ideology. The British state has been somewhat, how do we put it, not entirely happy with it, sort of the fact that Marx was here in London for a long time. As I'm sure you know, there's a little plaque in Dean Street where Marx lived, although Francis Wheen informs me in his excellent biography of Marx that the dates are wrong on that. But that's that. But what we do, what I want to also focus on is that Marxism comes back again and again. There is ambition, there is commitment on the part of those so involved. And so let's just have a little look. Let me get the clicker right. Yeah. At an overview, really, of some of what we're going to be considering. Understanding Marx is not easy. And I want to just, signal a few things in different directions about this. First, we need to get in mind a little about the influence of Hegel on Marx. There's much dispute about that, but that's one thing that we need to bear in mind. Marx also changed his views at different points in his writings. And there's a great deal of ambiguity. I mean, for example, he starts off reading philosophy and has an idea about, well, you should take one subject at a time. But by the time he comes to write Capital, much later, the relationship between different subjects, he's come to take the view that they're much more blurred, much more fluid in many respects. And that's just one example of how his views would seem to change. But a third problem is to do with the fact that when he died in 1883, that a great deal of what was ultimately published in 1930, 1941, wasn't there. The German ideology had not been published for all that had obviously been written. The Grundrissung had not been, was not published either, and obviously a great deal of his correspondence wasn't published. And so, in retrospect, we end up, putting together a corpus of material that wasn't there for those who went off, and we might be talking about Gramsci or Lukács, or of course the whole direction of Leninism and so forth. All of that is taking place, before we've got a number of crucial texts actually, being published. And just to give a further example, the phrase dialectical materialism, which is one that Marx never used, comes along with Plekhanov, a Russian Marxist, in that intervening time. I want to just make a couple of points, though, about this little list of things that we're going to think about in more detail. The philosopher, someone who I've taken quite a lot of interest in, the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, some time ago, he was interviewed by Brian McGee about Marx, and Taylor wanted to say, now, we have two lenses through which, as it were, to look at Marx. We can look at his thinking as an explanatory theory in one way or another, but we can also look at his thinking as a liberation theory. And that I'm going to come back to, what Taylor points out to be the tension that exists between those two lenses through which Marx, as it were, is viewing the world and viewing the material world and viewing our place, within that. The explanatory theory really pervades all of these different points that I'm wanting to bring to your attention. The liberation theory, perhaps, is to be found most especially towards the end of this. So let's begin and look a little bit at Hegel and the relationship that we find between the thinking of Hegel and that of Marx. Hegel wants to speak at some length about the procession of Geist, thought, spirit. And this is really, the unfolding of a rational process whereby through the self-discovery of reason, and as, thinking moves on and develop and comes to gather into itself the thinking of other cultures, we have what develops as a Volkgeist, a spirit of a people. All the time, this is going through a spirit of a time, a zeitgeist, but ultimately, as these tributaries of thought, rather like a river, gather together into a direction, that we come to have, as it were, a world spirit. So, to be very brief about this, for Hegel, history, thought, has a purpose that is discovered from within itself through its own rationality, because that's really the beating heart of this process for Hegel of history, is that it has rational momentum. What's the momentum? Well, the momentum is critique, that we have an idea, a series of ideas, and through the fact that we've got this as a rational process, it looks at itself in the mirror, whatever ideas there are around, and says, now, what's the mistake with this? What's the fault that we're finding here? And this means that there's something incredibly lifelike to this rational digestion, reflection. And at the heart, really, of this is Hegel's idealism. The true story is this story of mind. The whole business that I'm sure you're aware of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, whereby we have, one set of ideas that are then contrasted with another set of ideas that have come about as a result of the critique of what was first put forward, and then a combination of these two ideas come together in a synthesis that then forms the next thesis, and so forth in an ongoing triadic pattern. That's a kind of a bit of a conflation of what Hegel's wanted to say. We find it, in Fichte and other philosophers. But it is this kind of way of thinking that on the one hand influences Marx, and on the other hand is an aspect of how he is being responded against, really. But only with this in mind, can we really actually begin to, see the framework within which Marx is really operating. I think, one other thing to say just about Hegel is he stands somewhat in opposition to someone like Aristotle in terms of his understanding of logic. And I remember last year giving a talk about Kierkegaard, and I read Claire Carlyle's excellent little text, Kierkegaard, A Guide for the Perplexed. And that's just a pointer sort of over there to Kierkegaard and also to Claire Carlyle, an excellent philosopher in her understanding of Kierkegaard. And it seems that in Denmark there was, at this time, we're talking about the 1840s, much dispute about whether or not Aristotle's idea of, well, logic is something written in the nature of the universe, either X or not X, not an excluded middle. We can say that's not the case. As opposed to Hegel, who's wanting to say logic isn't fixed, because logic is not something about the universe out there, it's something about what's going on in here. It's to do with the mind. And the mind, according to Hegel, as we've just seen, is something whose reflections are constantly in motion, constantly in flux. So we have these different views even about logic that are taking place at the time. And as we've seen, this logic is leading to a terminal point. As far as Hegel's concerned, his own philosophy is where everything is leading to. I just say a little bit then about Marx's comments with respect to Hegel. I am a disciple of Hegel, yet I have taken the liberty of adapting a critical attitude towards my master, to rid his dialectic of its mysticism, and thus to subject it to a profound change. But the influence of Hegel on Marx is significant, and I just want to go through, some of these points. He picks up from Hegel the idea that the truth of one time is not the same as the truth of another. He has this processional view of things, and he also believes, as with Hegel, that thought is, and that in particular the material conditions of society are progressive. So there's an optimism, around in the thinking of both of these philosophers. He picks up also on the dialectic as a pattern of thought, and like Hegel, believes that things reach a terminus. Okay, but what's interesting is whereas for Hegel this is a matter to do with the world spirit, for Marx this is to do with the individual finding themselves at one with what he calls their species being, the whole collective. But this coming back together of the individual and the species being, or the whole, is something that is fundamentally brought about not through ideas, but through practice. But he also moves away, let's be clear about how Marx then departs from Hegel. It's been said that he turns Hegel on his head, that he wants to say the driving force of change is not at all ideas, but it is the material conditions of a time and place. Not so much some kind of changing logic, but economic law is what is the basis and the momentum behind change. So let's move and look a little bit at his picture of the base, the superstructure, and economic law. We can see there these three elements to the base of society, and this is where everything starts, as it were, with his idea of economic law. That we have here the material conditions of a time, that we have, that as it were, a place by the sea. Well, it's obviously going to give rise to a different type of production than somewhere else in land that perhaps has, significant mineral deposits. So the means of production will arise obviously from the raw materials that are available. And from these things, we also get then the production relations. Certain people will be the owners of the means of production, the tools, the machinery, and so forth. This is all part of the base. This is all to do with the material conditions. And part of what Marx wants to say is that there is a deterministic element to this, that none of this is accidental, that these processes are inevitable. Perhaps there's latitude in terms of just how things will work out, but within a margin. The changing character of society is inevitable. So all of these things, though, give rise to what he calls the superstructure. And here we are talking about literature, art, music, law, religion, all of these things, the mental life of a society, all of this is within the superstructure. And to just illustrate this, he uses the word reification to make real. And even language such as ownership, wages, capital, all of these things are things that come about within the capitalist bourgeois system. Okay, they don't exist before then in quite the way that they do at this time. That yes, there's been ownership in feudal times, but these things come to have new meaning when we have a rising bourgeoisie that takes control. With each different time, different words come about to label, what's taking place then. Let's just take a look at something that Marx has to say about this. This is from his preface to the Critique of Political Economy. In the social production of their life, men enter into definite relations that are indispensable and independent of their will. Relations of production which correspond to a definite stage of development of their material productive forces. The sum total of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real basis on which rises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the social, political, and intellectual life process in general. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but, on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. So, just a little bit more to quote here from Marx, and this is in his preface to Capital. The ultimate aim of this work, speaking of capital, is to lay bare the economic law of motion of modern society. So we're seeing very much how he has inverted the explanation of how things take place to be focused on the material conditions, on economic law. I think the only other thing I would say just at this point is this business about him not being a strict determinist. Leslie Stevenson, his little book, 10 Theories of Human Nature, suggests that when he is most careful, that Marx is claiming that the economic factors set the limits within which other factors can play their part. Just to say a little bit more, he does speak very much in terms of epochs, that there are one set of economic laws that, for example, govern tribal society, another set that given an Asiatic system of absolute monarchy, another system to do with ancient Greece and Rome, another system to do with the feudal society. And the other thing to say is that, of course, he's writing in German, and he used the word for science is Wissenschaft, but it's not quite science as we understand it in English. It is a broader, it carries a broader meaning in many ways, the arts as well. But what ties him down, and we'll come back to this, is the issue of his use of the word law, and he does want to say that economics is governed in that kind of a way. Let's look then at the road to revolution. Okay. In Capital, he puts forward a fairly clear account of how the capitalist system carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. And let's just look a little bit at this. He's wanting to say that capitalism is pretty brutally competitive, ruthlessly and relentlessly competitive. And as part of that process, it follows that to maximise profits, ever the most recent machinery will have to be put to work, built, and this means that smaller enterprises just will not be able to compete. With time, it will just be big businesses that will really be taking over. A consequence of this as well will mean that ultimately wages will have to be cut more and more. And with this, ultimately people will just have to be laid off. The problem with this is that the products being produced will be for consumers who have less and less to purchase with. And so that has the reciprocal effect that, as it happens, the whole process means that wages are cut more to keep the profits up, and ultimately we have a problem in terms of tax. You've got fewer and fewer people being employed, fewer and fewer people paying taxes, more and more people who are utterly destitute. We can't have the taxes really to support a police force that will keep people under any form of control. And in this way, capitalism is ultimately unsustainable. We can be colonists, says Marx, and we can try and use people somewhere else to do our, the worst of work. But these basic facts will apply in the long run. It's just a question of how long the run is, but it's going to be true all the same. And this is an example of how economic law is something that holds good. Even though there may be latitude about exactly, when things will come about. And let's just have another quote from Capital to put in his own words, what he's trying to get at here. Within the capitalist system, all methods for raising the social productivity of labour are brought about at the cost of the individual labourer. All means for the development of production transform themselves into means of domination over and exploitation of the producers. They mutilate the labourer into a fragment of a man, degrade him to the level of an appendage of a machine, destroy every remnant of charm in his work, and turn it into a hated toil. They estrange from him the intellectual potentialities of the labour process, in the same proportion as science is incorporated in it as an independent power. They distort the conditions under which he works, subject him during the labour process to a despotism the more hateful for its meanness. They transform his lifetime into working time and drag his wife and child beneath the wheels of the juggernaut of capital. We get here, I think some of, he was of course a journalist, and a very powerful writer, who did, both in his personality and in his pen, really draw people towards him in very many ways. This is an account of what he calls the objective side of the demise of capitalism. But there's also what he termed the subjective side of this as well. And this, I think, is really quite interesting. He is, in his life, not an armchair philosopher. He's not an armchair anything in many ways. He, someone argues with him and he gets into a duel with someone on several occasions. He had drunken brawls with different people in one way or another. He is someone. He is someone who acts as much as thinks. But he speaks in this respect about action consciousness. And he wants to say we can only understand through action. I think this is a very, very interesting and very important process as well. Just to make a reference to liberation theology in South America in the 1960s and 70s, and the writings of people like John Sobrino. And it was sometimes called kitchen theology, as opposed to something that happened in the sitting room. That theology was to be practiced to bring good news to the poor. Very, very. It couldn't simply pontificate, was in, and there's some dispute about this, prepared to use violence to bring about, some of the equalities that were being put forward. So this action consciousness means that in terms of this subjective end of capitalism, that people will realise the truth of what they're doing as they revolt, that all will become clear through the process of revolution, that as it were, people will find a heaven on earth in this process. And for those who want to sort of be naysayers about all this, well, how do they know? They're not going through this. So the argument goes, but we can see that this is if not careful, a pretty difficult argument. The other aspect, though, of all of this that we are coming to is the issue of alienation. And I think this is obviously could have an entire course on the subject of alienation. A very, very important topic, and a very important topic as well in our time. But what was Marx saying about alienation, and how does it dovetail with what we've already seen of his description of the demise of capitalism? Well, there are various things that he wants to bring to our attention. Let's just go through a few of them. First, he wants to say that alienation is a separation of two things that actually belong together. And it's a subsequent dysfunctional character of life and of us that portrays a falsehood, that we are led to believe that we should be working in such a way that our work is not, doesn't belong to us, when in fact it should belong to us. And in some sense, in terms of reality, as far as Marx is concerned, it does, and it ultimately will in the communist utopia. The second aspect, though, of this is that this dysfunctionality is painful. This is not simply just something that's, can be simply described. It's quite excruciating. And what people do with that sort of, as it were, negotiation of the pain of capitalism is they unknowingly come to have a kind of false consciousness. Religion, the nation, all of these are forms of false consciousness. They are a hankering after our species being, and a projection of that species being into the cosmos, into some picture of some political system like a nation. But they're really a dream, that's all they are. And of course, as he wanted to say of religion, it is an opiate. It's something that we cling on to when actually, we need to be operating for change to find, what is our real essence. How are we doing for time? Yes.
5 minutes?
5 minutes. Oh dear. Right. Thank you. Okay. So let's hurry up with some of this. Of course, just a few points about we're alienated from ourselves, we're alienated from our work, we're alienated from each other. All of these are aspects of alienation where what really should belong together is set apart. And his account of this also is very much linked in with, well, if we're alienated, we need to be alienated from something. And his understanding of human beings is that we are fundamentally what he calls homo faber, working beings, producing beings. That's really, part of what we are at heart. And so when we are working, but our work doesn't belong to us, our tools don't belong to us, there's this sort of not understood, sense of, things are not as they should be, but we can't work out what's going on for ourselves. One final point just on this issue of alienation. He fell out with a fellow thinker, Bruno Bauer, who was pushing for the idea of human rights. And he wanted to say, this is just a liberal wish. Human rights makes no sense. Why do we want human rights? We only want human rights if there is, we need to protect ourselves from someone else. But if we can overcome alienation, why would we ever need to protect ourselves from someone else? that this is a focus simply on negative liberty, he wants to say. Let's just have a little quote from Marx no, I haven't got this written down. Let's just turn to Marx again, and this is taken, oh sorry, it's not from Marx, it's David McClelland's paraphrase of Marx. Liberal rights and ideas of justice are premised on the idea that each of us needs protection from other human beings who are a threat to our liberty and security. Therefore, liberal rights are rights of separation, designated to protect us from such perceived threats. Freedom, on such a view, is freedom from interference. What this view overlooks is the possibility, for Marx, the fact that real freedom is to be found positively in our relations with other people. It is to be found in human community, not in isolation. I'm going to speak very, very quickly then about his real solution to things, or where he thinks things are going. So let's look at revolution, liberation, and the end of alienation. He was quite keen that the revolution would come in 1848, the year of revolutions. But by 1850, he was much more hesitant, really. And he wanted to say, just to take a couple of quotes from Marx here, a new revolution is only possible as a consequence of a new crisis. You have to endure and go through maybe 15, 20, 50 years of civil war in order to get the change in circumstances, in order to make yourselves fit for power. And those who were pushing for revolution when the circumstances were not right, he described as being the alchemists of revolution. But when it did come, he wanted to say in the Communist Manifesto that this would be not something simply located in London or Paris. It would be something that would ultimately spread globally, because that is its character. It would be the abolition of states. It would be the abolition of nations. More especially, it may be violent, it may not be. He had no problem with violence. He was never going to be a parliamentarian. I mean, of the 1871 Paris Commune, he described this as far too law-abiding. The killing of priests was all a bit too tame for him. Yeah, let's just pass on to a couple of other things. Yes, his description here of the communist society. In communist society, where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticise after dinner. The division of labour is gone, okay? And in particular, what he wants to say is that the species being will be found in microcosm in each and every individual, okay? And as such, the dictum from each according to their ability to each according to their needs will put no strain on anyone, because we will all see each other as the mirror of ourselves. We will all be this encapsulation of the species being. And this is an extraordinary sort of picture. It's heavily communitarian. And I want to sort of just make a point about that in terms of a couple of comments now. But it is the communist revolution, we'll have a period of what he calls socialism, where one leader will have to calm things down, and it will be a dictatorship in that sense. But with time, spontaneity will arise, and the laws will fall away. But we have hitherto been in a law-governed system. But following the revolution, as it were, what Taylor calls the liberation theory really takes over. And the fact that things are as they should be means that laws are no longer in place. And that's very much a situation that has, Charles Taylor is really quite critical of, how can we really make sense of this, a system where we've got a series of laws that then just seem to evaporate. What can we say about that? In terms of comments and criticisms, I'm just simply going to signal, a number of areas of question, and I'm sure you will have your questions to raise too. But some familiar faces, I have no doubt, there, Isaiah Berlin and Karl Popper. And just to, as it were, signal things very, very quickly. I think one thing to just pick out in this, I think the point that Popper makes about falsification, I think, is quite important. The revolution supposed to be a consequence of economic law, and yet when getting down to discussing, well, when this will arise and so forth, there's always a qualification that comes in, well, the conditions are not quite right. The conditions are not quite right, here and there and somewhere else. And so its pretensions to be something that is scientific, with every qualification about when the conditions will be said to be met, that is an erosion of those pretensions. If we understand, science and scientific method to proceed in the kind of way that Popper is suggesting, that things in principle, a scientific claim needs in principle to be open to the possibility of falsification. So that's one area of criticism. Another area of criticism is the issue of the character of explanation. Daniel Taylor, in his book Explanation and Meaning, writes at some length about the different character of scientific explanation on the one hand and historical explanation on the other, wanting to say that there really are different, these are different animals really, that I'm sure some of you are familiar with Carl Hempel and the covering law model of scientific explanation. What Taylor is wanting to get at is that in history we have narrative explanation, that we're dealing really with reasons rather than causes. That when, for example, A.J.P. Taylor says, well, the Second World War was the inevitable result of the First World War, his reasoning for that is a matter of a narrative, it's a matter of a story. It's not a matter of, well, H2O is at sea level pressure and is at 100 degrees centigrade and therefore it boils. We can't, as it were, itemize history in the way that we can itemize and isolate historical events. So that character of explanation is also something that is problematic. There's so much more to say, and I think at this time I should pass over to you. I think an enormous problem that I have with Marxism is its heavy communitarianism. And that, he's influenced quite a bit by Rousseau and Rousseau's idea of the general will. And his picture of freedom, where, as it were, we are each a microcosm of the species being, seems to me to leave little, if any, scope, really, for the individual being able to stand back from society in a sort of Kantian way, in what he says in that little wonderful essay, What is Enlightenment? And say, but just a minute, I'm not sure about, this political development. How can we, as it were, stand aside from society and be critical? Which strikes me as something that is vital for us always to be able to do, and is, in line with the classes that I run called the Critical Thinking Circle. I'm a huge devotee, really, of the idea of critical thinking. I think it's vital for our life and for our well-being. And the last point I'll just sort of say in 2 sentences is to do with this issue whether or not there is some religious character to Marxism. I think it's a very, very interesting question, but rather than say more about it, I will leave that to you to raise, if you like, in any questions.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much, John. Come and have a seat. We'll ask Paul to make his way down to get the microphone for your questions. So please do have a think about anything you'd like to ask. Put your hand up, and we should be able to see you and come to you. While we do that, just one quick question from me, John. If Marx were here with us tonight and not starting a drunken brawl or duel, hopefully, what do you think he would be most surprised by in terms of the state of the UK economy, government and business, and how surprised would he be?
I think that's such a difficult question. I mean, I think in some ways, and this is why I feel that Marxism is not dead, I think that he would say that to a certain extent, what he had to say, we see signs of this. We see, multinationals becoming more dominant in some ways than states. We see very many people, even in a highly developed country like Britain, fairly destitute. I was just reading Will Hutton recently, and I know he's a Keynesian, not a Marxist, but he made the point that if you were to ring fence, take the M25 and take that out of the economic equation of Britain, that the rest of Britain, is really more of a middle-income country than a highly developed country today. And I think where capitalism has been at its most raw and most unregulated, I think that there are enormous problems. I'm not a Marxist, I said that, but I think that Marx would not have given up on Marxism. Though it has to be said, I can't remember if I said this in my talk, he was accosted by some French Marxists, and what he had to say to them was that he was not a Marxist. I've always thought that was interesting.
Do we have some questions from the audience? Yes, I can see one on the left and then 2 on the right.
Okay.
We'll try and get through as many as we can in half an hour, so please keep them as brief as you can.
Is it on? Yes. So I was actually kind of struck by by your biography of Marx and that of Martin Luther, and both were sort of revolutionary figures in their own way. And I can't help but think that Marxism can only have been a product of a Christian society. It seems like it's hard to imagine Buddhist society coming up with Marxist ideas. What would you say?
That's very, very interesting. Sorry, did you mean Martin Luther or Martin Luther King?
No, Martin Luther.
Martin Luther, yes, thank you. Yes, I mean, I remember looking at a book edited by Dan Cohen-Sherbock called Liberation Theology in the World Religions. I mean, we have people like Thich Nhat Hanh, who's been thought to be something of a, been pushing in this kind of direction. I mean, we have that book Small is Beautiful, which is moving very, again in a Buddhist sort of context, Buddhist economics. E.F. Schumacher, yeah. But that doesn't really answer your question. You're asking about types of society. I mean, yeah, some would say that Marxism could only really have come about specifically in a Protestant type of society that was capitalist to the extent, in quite a raw sort of way. I don't know. I mean, we're talking on such a vast scale. If we actually begin to dig into sort of what would be needed to answer the question, I mean, I'm certainly not qualified in any way. But I think what I would say is that we might be talking about the Palestine Liberation Organization and the PDFLP and the PDLP, because of course it's splintered among the Trotskyites and the Marxists. Marxism has gone far and wide. It isn't as if when, for example, it reached non-Christian countries, it stopped at the door. And this is something that I find is fascinating about Marxism. I do think that it is I do actually personally think that it has elements of being a secular form of religion. I think it's extraordinarily powerful. It really does pull people in. And I don't think that Christianity, as it were, sets bounds to it. The issue of the origins, I don't think... I think that to have the kind of thinking that we have, we would need an industrial society that's pretty brutal. But whether or not Christianity was a precondition for that, I'm not at all sure about that. That's the kind of link I would question.
Let's take the next couple of questions. Up on your right, Paul. We've got two sitting next to each other on this.
Yeah. Marx's prophecies in relation to the development and ultimate end of capitalism 150 years or so later could obviously be said to be some way off the mark. But I wonder if his prognoses in more general terms could perhaps said to have some relevance today in regard to our fears and concerns regarding AI and the unchecked and rapid development of AI.
Yes, thank you very much for that. I think that I feel that Marx is something of a companion, really, in terms of we have friends who are family who are companions and will run things by people. But I think Marx is someone to, well, what insights does he perhaps have about something that's going on? And I think, for me, I think, and this is something that I mentioned, that I think the issue of alienation is a fact of modern Western life. In all sorts of ways, I think many people are very deeply alienated, most especially, and quite horrifically and distressingly, the young, in terms of mental health. And the evidence is, in Britain, utterly overwhelming about this. Now, and I think Marx is to be looked at here. Let's look at this a bit more with respect to AI. One thing that bothers me deeply is the depersonalization of the world. I think, whether it's trying to have a phone call someone at some utilities company or whatever it happens to be, or the world is becoming increasingly depersonalized. And I think that this was part of what Marx was getting at, that the whole system is a machine. I think from the point of view of people at the top of multinationals, I don't think this is a problem. They're living in a radically different world. And I think also there is not simply disregard, but utter disdain for a lot of us as ordinary people. So I think he would be saying of AI, I told you so. I think.
Right, in the long run. One more, yes.
So one brief observation and then a question. So the brief observation is that at the moment we have, as you say, very large groups of alienated individuals, but they don't seem to be reaching for Marx. They're reaching for Trump, Farage, and all sorts of people at arguably the opposite end of the perhaps emotional spectrum. So as a brief thought experiment, so a lot of Marx was about production, the means of production, the ownership of the product, etc. So if we perhaps transplant Marx to today, where very few of us actually make anything, then how does that work? Because we have service economies in large parts of the world. Stuff can only be produced with massive collaborative efforts. And so how do we imagine that Marx would have developed his ideas in a world where nobody actually physically makes anything?
Yes. I mean, clearly, if we could bring Marx back, he would perhaps be saying some different things to the things that he did say. And that is the work of sort of neo-Marxists. They don't have to stick utterly to Marx and to his writings, and that's the difference compared with some religions that want to stick very tightly to a text. But I think the sorts of things that might be picked out from what Marx is getting at is that that there is a brutalization process that does not seem to be being ameliorated really over time. And I think this is very, very interesting. I remember seeing a film about Marxism that was sort of put out in the 1970s or something. And the part of what was being said was, look, we have a health service, and capitalism has lost some of its hard edges. But what strikes me, 40, 50 years later, is that those hard edges have come back. And this is part of what Will Hutton is getting at. He's wanting to say, well, we had Keynesianism for quite a while, up until around about 1980. But then a really quite harsh neoliberalism has come in, and now we're at we're at a point in this new period that is pretty desperate. It strikes me that is about right. I mean, in Britain, I mean, Keir Starmer may be wrong about many things. I don't want to talk about Keir Starmer particularly, but I mean, the point that the degree of mental health among the young is not sustainable has to be true. Well, we have 1 in 5 young people not attending school, and I've been a school teacher for ages. This strikes me as absolutely cataclysmic. And it's the sort of thing that, well, we'll be picking up the tab, especially 10, 15, 20 years down the line. But it strikes me as we are in a bad place.
That's sparked some questions. We have, where are you, Paul?
I'm here.
Okay. We've got one to your left, and then you can work your way forward. We've got two in the row there. So yeah,
It's
let's go.
not really related to Marxism in any way at all, but do you think there is any hope for humanity, and if so, where does it come from?
Yes is the answer. I do think that there's hope for humanity, and here I'm influenced a little bit by Hegel. I think so often you kind of, I was fascinated, Nick sort of mentioned a list of all the things that can go wrong in terms of tech and so forth. I was so impressed with this list of all the things that could go wrong. I thought it's just massively organised. But of course, we all know the things that do go wrong are things we never thought of. But we can flip that over as well. And so often, the things that actually, go right are things we've never thought of. But life is full of surprises. I mean, that we've made progress with Northern Ireland. South Africa, the end of apartheid. There was a time when a number of things looked to have gone right that we thought we would never ever solve. And I also think, just as we've had what I will be frank, in my view, is this hideous turn to the right and the far right, with Farage and the unmentionable beyond him. It strikes me that, well, there is a reaction against that. And here, because there's always change, we don't know what will come next. And we can have a real reaction against Trump. I mean, this afternoon, sorry, I don't mean to go on about it.
Take some more questions, John.
Sorry. Yeah. Let's.
There is hope.
Yeah.
There
is hope.
And Marx was quite optimistic in the long run. It was just going to be a very long run.
Yes.
Yes, we have two next to you. And who else had their hand up? Okay, great. Little cluster there. Great.
I just wanted to ask, do you think that Marx, it seems from what you're saying, does he think that human nature is fundamentally good? And is that a problem? Like, does he think that we're good people, we just want to work hard, but it's just the means of production that aren't, or the conditions that aren't right? And maybe that's sort of also something that's quite appealing about Marxism.
Thank you very much for bringing us back to Marx. It was my fault that we'd gone astray. Yes, is the answer to your question. And this is very important and is something with respect to Christianity, because of course Christianity has the idea of the fall, that we are fundamentally, we cannot help ourselves. We are fallen creatures and we need external help to put ourselves together. And Marx is wanting to say that's false. He's wanting to say that history ultimately takes us to our liberation. I mean, as I say, I'm not a Marxist, and this is one reason why I'm not. I don't think that history is so determined. But that's part of the place where hope can be. But the fact, well, for me, the fact that it isn't determined means that it is down to us. I don't believe that we're fallen creatures. I believe everything, so much is within our hands. I mean, but we are going to have to deal with some things like climate change that are, sort of barely in our grasp. But I think this is, that Marx, I think here, helps us in a way that some forms of religion don't. That he's saying, you are not sullied to the point of needing external help from a God. That you have the resources within society, within yourselves, and within history, in his case, to do better and to move forward. Now, I think there's truth in that. How much truth there is down to us.
There was one next year, and then we've got two at the front, and then we'll get to you. Yeah. Let's keep answers quick as well, John, so we get through.
Yeah.
So, accepting that his interpretation of inequality creates strife, what was the logic that said there's only one answer, which is revolution? What happened to negotiation? What happened to... he'd gone for the entropy end as opposed to the equilibrium end. Now, if you look at the societies in Scandinavia, the capitalist system and the worker system actually has a really good equilibrium. So why did he only see one inevitable path?
Yes, I mean, if we think of his time, the time of Dickens, the Victorian London, the utter brutality of what's going on, around him. And there seems to be no mercy. He can't, I think, imagine that, the brutality of the mills and the mines will ever show a kinder face. I don't think, it just isn't what he's observing. I mean, if we think of London of the 1840s, and the horrendous smog, and the horses, and just the disease. I mean, his children die. Some of his Freddie dies. It's just an awful world that he's living in.
Thank you. Let's take the two here together. If you go one after the other. And then
Whereabouts are they? Yeah, just here. Oh, brilliant.
Yeah, examples.
I think my question just echoes a little bit of what you've been speaking about, but I have read that Marx certainly didn't expect the revolution to take place in Russia, but he expected it to take place in a fully industrialized society. Can you say anything about how it is that Russia actually lent itself to the revolution?
Oh, let's have the next question as well.
Oh, right, John, thank you. This question comes at a rather uncomfortable time because I want to raise a question about the possible religious connections or resonances of Marxism. And one thing that hasn't mentioned, we've heard of Martin Luther, but what we've not mentioned is the fact that Marx was born a Jew, though he was then baptized to avoid the discrimination against Jews. But is it just conceivable that he also represents one of the best aspects of the Jewish tradition, which is the prophetic tradition of Amos and others, who concerned themselves with the plight of the poor and the oppressed?
Well, thank you. I'm not sure he would love being associated with biblical prophets. He might not thank you for that, but I mean, I think the idea of rolling down justice from the mountains, this Old Testament and Jewish terms, that this stuff from the Torah. I think there are definitely resonances of that. Coming to the first question, Marx absolutely thought that Germany and England would be the countries, and Britain would be the countries where the revolution would begin. Towards the end of his life, I read in Francis Wheen that he did actually think that it might take place in Russia, in some of his later writings. The fact that there was a revolution there And that thinking is not to do with necessarily to do with the kinds of factors that Marx would have pointed to. And I'm sure there are many people here who know far more about the Russian Revolution than I do. But it strikes me that, you know, quite horrific sort of aristocracy was, and yes, grinding poverty, but a complete lack of empathy was part of you know, what raised enormous rage in people. But I don't feel qualified to say more than that at all.
We'll just take one last question at the front here, Paul. Yes, it's you.
Am I last?
Well,
good.
I think so. Yeah. Well, still be brief.
No, coming from a society which were living under the Marxist philosophy, and with famous philosopher Lukács, who was indicted with a lot of problems for certain members of society in Hungary towards the end, when the communist rule had to some degree finished. There was a lot of questions about whether Marxism was the actual structure of the thought process, was the thing that was at fault, or was it certain individuals who were, if you like, manipulating the philosophy. And in the end, they came to the conclusion that it wasn't the individuals, it was the Marxist philosophy itself. Now, my question is, in the future, when there is AI, and there will be a whole social structure where there will be a group of people who are to do with AI, and there would be the rest of us, or rather I won't be around, but people like me would be around who are not very much to do with AI. Is there going to be a class war then?
Yes, I think I think that what you said is very, very interesting, because I think that's something that we're not necessarily aware. Is my microphone working?
No longer.
Try this
one. Yes, no, I think that's very interesting, because I think there is a constant push towards elitism from various people, and that as such we need to always be protecting ourselves in terms of all sorts of collectives against that. Because I think that is very much how aspects of Silicon Valley see themselves as being above humanity. And the whole business of post-humanism, someone like Nick Bostrom, who was associated with Oxford University, who wants to sort of delay death, indefinitely, for the elite who can afford whatever it would take to do that. I think there is very much an enormous elitism, and we must do whatever we can, to be moving in a different direction, and to be alerting people that, who are the people who are wanting to put us apart in this kind of a way.
Thank you so much, John. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for some wide-ranging and fascinating questions and contributions, as always. Our next talk is going to be on the 21st of October, and I'm excited to say, due to the hard work of Paul, who we usually forget to thank, but I won't today, we're really excited to have Professor Lizzie Fricker from Oxford University joining us to pick up seamlessly on the last question around AI, and she's going to be talking about whether we should trust Chat GPT and other bots in respect of what they tell us. And my first thought is, well obviously not, and don't we all know that by now? But clearly, as a species and as a society, we're voting with our feet in the other direction, voting with our thumbs in the other direction, placing growing reliance on what artificial intelligence tells us in various ways. But who's responsible for what they say? How and why? And what does it mean? So please do join us for that. You can book on via the OSO Arts website. And we really look forward to seeing you in hopefully a month's time. Thank you again, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Paul. And thank you, John.
Sorry, just very, very briefly, this is a naked self-advertisement. I run some courses under the title of the Critical Thinking Circle. I'll put the details up in just a second. But courses are starting next week. One on hermeneutics, the history of interpretation, and a second one, broader, to do with alienation and making sense of our place in the world. But there are some spaces on each course. I have a maximum of 16 people. They're online. And I'm also teaching at City Lit. Also, if any of you are interested in my book, Judging Religion, A Dialogue for Our Time, which is not Richard Dawkins, and it's not a defence of religion either. I've tried to plough a middle path. Then I'll leave some cards here, and you're welcome to take them. Thank you very much.
Thank you.